The first thing I noticed after my daughter-in-law poured an entire glass of Cabernet over my head was not the wine dripping from my hair or the laughter around the table. It was my son's face. Ethan wasn't shocked. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even angry at his wife. He was looking past me at a phone held chest high by one of Vanessa's friends, making sure the camera had caught everything. Vanessa stood there with the empty crystal glass in her hand, smiling like she had finally said something she had been waiting years to say. "You miserable poor old man." She laughed. The room went strangely quiet after that. The kind of silence people make when they've enjoyed something cruel, but suddenly realize they may have enjoyed it too openly. I took a white linen napkin from the table, wiped the wine from my eyes, and said nothing. 10 minutes later, the hotel's general manager hurried into the ballroom, stopped beside me, and said, "Mr. Chairman, should I have security remove anyone?" Vanessa's smile disappeared so quickly I almost felt sorry for her. "My name is Thomas Hale. I was 69 years old that evening. And for most of my adult life, people who knew my business knew my name before they knew my face. That suited me fine. I had never enjoyed being recognized in restaurants or introduced with a list of accomplishments. My late wife, Margaret, used to tease me about it. She said I could own half the buildings on a block and still dress like the man hired to repair the boiler. She wasn't entirely wrong. The navy suit I wore to Ethan and Vanessa's anniversary party was 11 years old. Margaret had picked it out for me before a charity dinner in Raleigh, and I kept wearing it because it still fit, and because I could hear her voice every time I buttoned the jacket. If you've ever learned something painful about your own family, you already know the worst part is rarely the moment everyone sees. It's the small things you remember afterward. Mine started 3 weeks before that glass of wine ever left Vanessa's hand. Ethan came to my house on a Tuesday morning carrying coffee he knew I didn't drink. That was the first sign he wanted something. My son was 40, tall like me, though better dressed, with the kind of polished confidence that worked well in conference rooms and less well when someone asked him a question he didn't want to answer. He ran a small real estate development company focused on upscale townhouses around Charlotte. I had helped him get started 9 years earlier with a private loan, which he repaid. And I had quietly helped again when a construction delay nearly buried his second project. That second time, he never quite repaid all of it. I never pressed. That was one of my mistakes. Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table, slid a folder in my direction, and said he needed $750,000 to bridge financing on a development in South End. He spoke quickly, almost casually, as if he were asking me to cover lunch. I opened the folder and found renderings, market projections, photographs of cleared land, and a summary page full of optimistic numbers. What I didn't find were lender terms, signed investor commitments, updated construction estimates, or anything showing what happened if sales came in 20% below projections. "How much equity is already committed?" I asked. Ethan leaned back. "Dad, it's temporary. 90 days. Maybe 120. I asked the question again. His jaw tightened. "Why does everything with you have to be an interrogation?" I told him it wasn't an interrogation. It was $750,000. He stared at me for a moment and then said, "You put millions into hotels without blinking." That sentence stayed with me. He didn't say I had invested millions. He said I had put millions into hotels, as though the difference between a business asset and a family rescue should have meant nothing simply because the money came from me. I told Ethan I wasn't saying no. I told him to send me the financing package, the investor list, the debt schedule, and the guarantees. If the numbers made sense, I would consider participating under written terms. He looked at me as though I had insulted him. "Participating," he repeated. "I'm your son." I reminded him that being my son was exactly why I wanted the arrangement clean. Money had already damaged enough between us. Ethan stood, pushed his chair in harder than necessary, and said something that reached farther back than the folder between us. "You know, when I was a kid, you missed my games because the hotels needed you. Now the hotels don't need you, and somehow I still have to schedule an appointment to matter." He left the coffee untouched. I sat there for a long time afterward because there was truth in what he had said. Truth doesn't stop being truth just because someone uses it unfairly. Margaret and I had started with a roadside motel outside Greensboro in 1988. The kind of place where we painted rooms ourselves and replaced broken air conditioners at midnight. Over 30 years, that one property became Hale Lodging Group, a regional company with upscale business hotels and resort properties across North and South Carolina. I stepped back from daily operations after Margaret died 4 years earlier. But I remained chairman and controlled 62% of the voting interest through my personal trust. Ethan knew that. Very few people outside the company did. I never made a point of telling Vanessa. She had married my son 10 years earlier, and somewhere along the way she seems to have decided I was simply a retired businessman living carefully because I didn't have much left. I never corrected her. Money has a way of changing how people sit beside you. I preferred seeing people before they knew what I owned. Vanessa called 2 days after Ethan's visit. Her voice was pleasant at first. She asked how I was sleeping, whether I had been eating properly, whether I was still walking every morning. Then she arrived where she had been heading all along. Ethan is under enormous pressure, she said. He doesn't need his father treating him like some stranger from the street. I told her I had offered to review the deal. She said, "You're 69. Tom, at some point you have to ask yourself what all that saving is for. You can't take it with you." Vanessa had called me Tom since the day we met. Never Dad. Never Mr. Hale. Which never bothered me. What bothered me was the assumption tucked inside her words. She believed the money existed primarily to be distributed to people who had already decided they deserved it. I told her, "The money isn't the issue, Vanessa. Clarity is." Her voice cooled. Sometimes clarity is just another word wealthy people use when they don't trust their family. Then she hung up. 3 weeks later, I drove my old Ford F-150 into downtown Charlotte for Ethan and Vanessa's 10th anniversary celebration at the Ashford Grand. Vanessa had chosen the ballroom herself. She loved that hotel, though apparently she had never bothered to ask who owned the controlling interest in the company behind it. I arrived early enough to see staff arranging champagne flutes under warm chandeliers and a photographer taking pictures of an enormous white and gold cake. Vanessa greeted me near the entrance, glanced at my suit, and said, "You could have let Ethan take you shopping." I smiled and told her Margaret had bought it. That ended the conversation. My place card was at a table near the back with 2 distant relatives and several people I had never met. Ethan's closest business associates were seated near the front. I noticed that because Vanessa had described the evening as an intimate family celebration, half the room looked like people attending an investor reception. Before dinner, a man in his 50s introduced himself as Charles Grayson and told me he worked with a private lending group in Atlanta. He shook my hand warmly. "Good to finally meet you." Ethan speaks highly of the family platform. I asked what platform he meant. Grayson smiled. "The hospitality backing makes the development package a lot more comfortable." He moved on before I could ask another question. A few minutes later, I heard another guest congratulate Ethan on having deep family support behind the South End deal. I watched my son across the ballroom. He was laughing with a group of men around a cocktail table. Vanessa had one hand looped through his arm, smiling as though the future had already been approved. I suddenly understood why so many investors were at an anniversary party. This wasn't just an anniversary party. It was a room full of people Ethan needed to impress. And somehow my name had already entered conversations I had never been invited to. I waited until dinner was nearly over before pulling Ethan toward a quiet corridor beside the ballroom. "What have you told these people?" I asked. He frowned. "About what I mentioned Grayson and the supposed hospitality backing." Ethan rubbed the side of his neck. He had done that since he was 12 whenever he needed a few seconds to invent an answer. "Nobody said Hale Lodging guaranteed anything. I just told them you support the family." I told him there was a difference between emotional support and implying corporate assets stood behind a real estate project. His eyes hardened. "You always do this. You make everything sound criminal when someone asks you to share." I said, quietly, "Listen carefully. I have not committed $1 of Hale Lodging money, one hotel asset, or one personal guarantee to your development. Do not let anyone leave this building believing otherwise." That was when Vanessa appeared at the end of the corridor. She walked toward us, holding a glass of red wine and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing now?" she asked Ethan. Though she was looking at me, I told her we were clearing up a misunderstanding. Vanessa stepped closer. "No, Tom, you're embarrassing him. Again." I said I was trying to keep him from making promises he couldn't legally make. Her smile vanished. "Nobody here cares about your little retirement account." Ethan said her name softly, but he didn't tell her to stop. I looked at him. "Not her. Did you tell investors I was backing the project?" He hesitated 1 second too long. Vanessa laughed. "My God. You really think you're important, don't you?" A few guests had drifted near enough to hear us. I could feel attention shifting in our direction. Then I saw the phone. One of Vanessa's friends stood several feet away, recording with the camera angled directly toward me. I turned back toward Vanessa just as she lifted her glass. There was no stumble, no accidental bump. She tipped it slowly over the top of my head. Cold wine ran through my hair, across my forehead, and down the collar of Margaret's old suit. Vanessa gave a sharp little laugh and said, loud enough for the people nearest us to hear, "You miserable poor old man." Someone gasped. Someone else snickered before stopping himself. Ethan froze beside her. I looked at him again. His eyes were not on his wife. They were on the phone. That mattered more to me than the wine. I took a napkin from an abandoned service tray and wiped my face. Vanessa seemed almost disappointed. "Nothing to say?" she asked. "Not yet," I told her. Then I walked back into the ballroom, found my coat, and asked a server where I could clean myself up. I had been standing near the lobby restrooms for perhaps 10 minutes when Daniel Mercer came toward me at a near run. Daniel was the general manager of the Ashford Grand. 52. Precise. Loyal. And usually impossible to rattle. That night he looked furious. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "I just heard what happened. Should I have security remove anyone?" His words carried farther than he intended. Vanessa and Ethan had followed me into the lobby, along with several curious guests. Vanessa stopped dead. "Chairman," she said. Daniel looked from her to me and immediately understood there was something he had not been told. I said, "No security. Daniel, this is a family matter." Vanessa stared at me as if a wall had opened behind my chair. Ethan looked down. That told me he had known exactly what would happen if anyone from the hotel's senior staff recognized me. I turned to Daniel and asked if there was somewhere private I could change. Daniel took me upstairs to the executive lounge and had housekeeping bring a clean shirt from the hotel boutique. While I changed, he stood by the window with his arms folded. "There's something else," he finally said. I asked what. He hesitated, then opened a folder he had carried from his office. 3 days earlier, corporate sales had received supporting materials connected to a private investor gathering Ethan's company planned to host at the hotel. Daniel had noticed my name and assumed I already knew. He placed one page on the table. Across the top was Ethan's development company logo. Near the bottom, under a paragraph describing financial support, were the words "backed by the Hale family hospitality portfolio." Attached was a letter of intent indicating that I expected to provide capital support and strategic backing. I read it twice. Then I reached the signature line. The name looked exactly like mine. The angle of the T, the long stroke under Hale, even the small upward hook Margaret used to tease me about. Daniel said, "I assumed your office had approved it." I touched the page with 2 fingers and said, "My office never saw this." For the first time that night, I felt something colder than embarrassment. The signature was almost certainly a scan from an old document. I had signed thousands of pages over the years. Finding one would not have been difficult for someone with access to family or corporate files. The important question was not how it had been copied. It was who had decided they were entitled to use it. I thought about Ethan's untouched coffee, Vanessa telling me I couldn't take money with me, the investors describing family backing, and that phone already recording before the wine was poured. None of those things proved a conspiracy by themselves. Together, they changed the shape of the evening. Daniel asked whether I wanted him to call our corporate attorney. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the folder. "Not tonight," I said. Tonight I want everyone downstairs to think I went home angry and embarrassed. Daniel studied me for a moment, then nodded. I looked once more at the signature that wasn't mine, and realized my daughter-in-law insulting me was no longer the problem. Someone in my family had started spending my name before they ever got my money. Ethan showed up at my house the next morning at 7:40, 20 minutes earlier than he ever visited unless he wanted control of the conversation before I had time to prepare. I had already been awake for 2 hours. The wine-stained suit hung in the laundry room, and Daniel's folder sat unopened on the kitchen table even though I knew every line inside it by memory. Ethan walked in without waiting for me to invite him, tossed his keys beside the sink, and said, "You made Vanessa look like an idiot last night." Not, "Hello." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" I poured myself coffee and asked whether the woman who emptied a glass over my head required my help to look foolish. His face tightened. "You knew what Daniel was going to call you." I almost laughed. Somehow, in Ethan's version of events, my great offense was allowing the manager of my own hotel to recognize me. That was when I understood how desperately he needed the conversation to be about anything except the paper in Daniel's folder. I placed the supposed letter of intent between us. Ethan looked down, and something in his expression changed before he could hide it. Not surprise, recognition. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I told him Daniel found it in the material submitted for his investor gathering. Ethan picked it up and skimmed the first page too quickly for a man supposedly seeing it for the first time. I pointed to my signature. "Did you send this?" He lowered the paper. "Dad, it's a draft." I asked why a draft had my signature. Ethan exhaled sharply and said one of his assistants must have used a scanned signature from an older document to make the presentation package look complete. "It doesn't mean anything legally." I told him legal effect was not the only issue. A document didn't need to transfer property to mislead someone. If an investor saw my signature beneath language promising Hale family support, he might make a financial decision believing I stood behind the deal. Ethan's answer came immediately. Nobody was misled. Then I asked, "How do you know what everyone believed?" He had no answer. He started pacing my kitchen, the same room where he had eaten cereal before school, and once built a model bridge for a science fair. Margaret attended alone because I was in Charleston, negotiating a hotel purchase. "You're turning this into something it isn't," he said. "Vanessa screwed up. She had too much wine. I'm sorry she embarrassed you. But this project is real. The land is real. The investors are real. And nobody is stealing anything from you." I asked whether he had told Charles Grayson that Hale Lodging stood behind his development. I told him my family had resources. I asked whether he understood what Grayson meant when he said the hospitality backing made him comfortable. Ethan stopped pacing. "People make assumptions." I nodded. "And you corrected those assumptions," his silence answered. Then his anger returned. He told me I had spent his entire childhood building a company he was now expected to pretend had nothing to do with him. "You made the Hale name valuable," he said. "Don't act offended because your son uses it." For the first time, I heard entitlement spoken as inheritance rather than greed. I told him using our surname was one thing, using my signature was another. Ethan leaned against the counter and rubbed his neck. "You're 69, Dad. Eventually, someone has to carry things forward." The phrasing caught my attention. Carry things forward. It sounded rehearsed, almost like language from a meeting. I asked exactly what he thought he was carrying forward. He stared at me, then said, "Forget it." I pushed too hard after that. It was my first mistake. I told him if he did not give me a complete explanation, every dollar of financial support from me would stop immediately. No bridge loan. No future investment. No quiet rescue if construction costs blew up. The color drained from his face, then returned with anger. "There it is," he said. "Money. That's always how you win." He walked out before I could answer. I stood in the doorway watching his car back into the street and knew I had just done what an inexperienced negotiator does when frightened. I had shown him where my leverage was before I knew where his was. An hour later, I tried logging into a shared online data room Ethan had given me access to months earlier when he first discussed the South End project. My password no longer worked. I reset it and received a message saying my account had been removed by the administrator. That was not illegal. It was his company's data room, and he had every right to restrict access. But the timing told me something useful. Ethan was no longer trying to persuade me. He was trying to control what I could see. I called Rachel Kim, who had been my personal attorney and corporate counsel on sensitive Hale family matters for nearly 15 years. Rachel was 51, compact, patient, and allergic to dramatic language. When I told her about the signature, she did not call it fraud or forgery. She asked who received it, what representations accompanied it, whether anyone transferred money because of it, and whether the signature was presented as authentic. We establish facts first, she said. Labels come later. I needed that discipline. Anger had already cost me access to one source of information. I was not going to lose another. Rachel came to my house that afternoon. I handed her Daniel's copies and told her exactly what had happened at the party, including the phone recording Vanessa before she poured the wine. She read the letter twice and said the document by itself did not transfer any Hale lodging ownership, pledge company property, or create an obvious enforceable guarantee. That was the good news. The bad news was more complicated. If they circulated this knowing you did not approve it, and investors relied on it, that could become very serious. She said, civil exposure at a minimum, potentially more, depending on intent and what money changed hands. I asked whether we should contact law enforcement. Rachel shook her head. Not yet. Not because it isn't serious. Because we don't know enough. She advised me to preserve every document, avoid accusations, and have corporate staff quietly flag any external communication mentioning my name, my trust, or Hale Lodging in connection with Ethan's company. She also told me something I did not enjoy hearing. Stop threatening him. Tom, if he thinks you're building a case, documents start disappearing. Vanessa called before dinner. Her tone was entirely different from the night before. Soft, controlled, almost wounded. I owe you an apology, she said. I waited. I should never have poured wine on you. Still, I waited. Then came the sentence I expected. But you need to understand what you do to Ethan. She said he had spent his entire life feeling judged, measured, and kept outside a family legacy that everyone assumed would someday be his. According to Vanessa, my insistence on reviewing his deal had humiliated him in front of his wife and business partners. I told her humiliation did not create my signature on a document. There was a pause. I don't know anything about a signature. Her answer was too fast. I said nothing. Vanessa filled the silence. Tom, sometimes older parents hold on to control because they're afraid of becoming irrelevant. I looked across my empty kitchen at Margaret's chair. Vanessa continued, maybe this is really about you not being ready to let go. That was clever. If I defended myself, I accepted her premise. So I simply said, maybe. We'll let the paperwork tell us. For the next 4 days, I did nothing visible. That was harder than any board fight I had ever survived. Every instinct told me to confront Ethan again, call his investors, demand his files, and force the truth into the open. Rachel persuaded me that silence would produce more information than pressure. Hale Lodging's CFO, Martin Bell, quietly instructed our finance department to notify him of any verification requests connected to Ethan, Vanessa, their development company, or the South End project. Our IT team preserved email traffic involving my corporate address without telling anyone why. Daniel saved the original submission package from the hotel's sales department and locked the files against deletion. I also asked Daniel for security footage from the anniversary evening. He sent several camera angles. Most had no usable audio, but they showed enough. Vanessa stood near the corridor before approaching me. Twice. She glanced toward her friend holding the phone. A few seconds before lifting the glass, Vanessa looked directly at the phone again. It did not prove planning. It did prove awareness. The phone video itself appeared online 2 days later. One of Ethan's younger business contacts texted the link to a mutual acquaintance. Who sent it to Martin? Who sent it to me? The clip lasted 28 seconds. It began with Vanessa saying, "You really think you're important, don't you?" It showed her pouring the wine, calling me a miserable poor old man, and me wiping my face. Then it ended. "No, Daniel, No, Mr. Chairman. No context about the conversation with investors. The caption described me as an angry, controlling father-in-law who had tried to ruin his son's anniversary party over money. I watched it 3 times. Not because it hurt more each time, but because I wanted to understand what had been removed. Whoever posted it wanted one story visible: an old man interfering in his adult son's life, publicly put in his place. Rachel asked whether I wanted to respond. No, I said. If someone needs me angry, I'm not giving them angry. For once, I was learning before reacting. The clip spread just far enough to become inconvenient without becoming famous. 2 hotel employees asked Martin if there was trouble in the Hale family. A vendor called one of our regional managers after recognizing me. More troubling. A relationship manager from a bank we had used for years contacted Hale Lodging with a routine-sounding question about succession planning. Martin forwarded the note to me. The bank representative claimed it was part of a periodic review. But the timing bothered Rachel. She called him and asked what prompted the question. He would only say they had heard discussion of changing family leadership. That was the first moment the party stopped being merely humiliating and began touching the company Margaret and I had spent decades building. No credit facility was threatened, and no lender accused us of instability. But a rumor had entered the bloodstream. I remembered Ethan saying, "Eventually, someone has to carry things forward." Those words now sounded less like resentment and more like something he had been told to repeat. That evening, I sat alone in my den and found myself remembering Ethan at 17. It had been after a varsity baseball game I missed because a major plumbing failure shut down 40 rooms, and I came home after midnight carrying an envelope with money for a new glove he wanted. He left it unopened on the table. "You always show up with a check after missing the part that mattered," he told me. Margaret stood behind him, arms folded, and I knew from her face that she agreed. I had never forgotten the sentence, but I had spent 23 years misunderstanding the lesson. I thought the solution was to give more generously. Tuition, a car, his first down payment, capital for his business, emergency cash when projects went wrong. Every check reduced my guilt temporarily and increased his dependence permanently. That realization did not excuse what was happening now, but it explained why Ethan could honestly believe refusing him money was an act of cruelty. I had trained him to confuse financial access with love, then resented him for learning the lesson. Rachel called me the next morning and asked me to come to her office. She had found something through an external records review and internal document comparison. 7 months earlier, Vanessa had emailed a financial advisory firm in Charlotte. The firm had been approached about what she described as long-term family succession planning. Rachel could not access privileged communications, but an email and attachment had been forwarded to an outside consultant who later contacted Hale Lodging for public information. That forwarded email had eventually reached our system during a routine inquiry. Vanessa had written, "What options exist when an aging, controlling shareholder begins showing signs that financial decision-making may be impaired?" She never used my name. She did not need to. Attached was an ownership chart for Hale Lodging Group. My trust was clearly marked with a 62% voting interest. Ethan's existing non-voting interest appeared beneath it. I stared at the screen for several seconds before asking Rachel whether that structure was publicly available. She shook her head. Not in this form. That chart had been created internally 2 years earlier during estate planning discussions. Only a small group had received it, Rachel. Martin, 2 outside advisors, me, and Ethan. I remembered giving Ethan his copy over lunch. At the time, I had been considering whether to increase his economic interest in the company without transferring operational control. He barely looked at the pages and said, "Hotels were my world, not his." I had taken that as indifference. Rachel enlarged the attachment and compared the formatting. Same blue header, same trust labels, same small typo in the footnote describing one subsidiary. There was no realistic possibility Vanessa had reconstructed it from public information. Someone had given it to her. I wanted to call Ethan immediately. Rachel closed her laptop before I could reach for my phone. "Don't," she said. "You already warned him once." I asked the question anyway, though both of us knew the answer. Who else had a family reason to give Vanessa that chart? Rachel did not respond. I drove home slowly, taking streets I had known before half the neighborhoods existed. 7 months. That was what changed everything. Vanessa's email had not followed the anniversary party. It had not followed my refusal to hand Ethan $750,000. It had come months before either event. She had already been asking what happened when an older, controlling shareholder could supposedly no longer make financial decisions. Maybe she had been planning responsibly. Maybe she had simply feared what would happen to Ethan if I became ill. Those innocent explanations still existed. And Rachel reminded me not to outrun the evidence. But paired with the scanned signature, the investor claims, the selective video, and Ethan's knowledge of my ownership percentage, another possibility had begun to take shape. They were not only trying to borrow my money. Someone had been thinking about what happened to my control. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the truck, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. The wine had washed out of my hair in 5 minutes. The insult would fade too. But the ownership chart could only have come from inside my family. And for the first time, I wondered how long Ethan had been helping Vanessa plan for a future in which I was still alive, but no longer in charge. I spent the next 48 hours resisting the urge to accuse my son of something I could not yet prove. That was harder than it sounds. Anger gives you the illusion of movement. Silence feels like surrender, especially when the person on the other side is family. Rachel kept reminding me that evidence had to come before interpretation. We already knew Vanessa had obtained the ownership chart. We knew someone had circulated a letter with my scanned signature. We knew investors believed Hale Lodging stood behind Ethan's project. What we did not know was whether Ethan had merely been careless, whether Vanessa had acted without his full knowledge, or whether both of them had been preparing something larger. So I did something Ethan did not expect. I called him and said, "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe it's time we talk seriously about succession." There was a long silence. Then his voice softened. "You mean that?" I told him I was willing to listen. That was the first lie I had told my son in years. We met at a private dining room in a quiet steakhouse near South Park. Somewhere Ethan liked because he could be seen without feeling watched. He arrived wearing a charcoal suit and no tie. The way younger businessmen dress when they want to appear both successful and too busy to care. I let him order wine. I ordered water. For the first 20 minutes, we discussed nothing important. He told me about construction delays, interest rates, permit problems, and a subcontractor who had walked off one of his sites. I listened. Then I said I had been considering whether my current ownership structure still made sense. Ethan leaned back carefully, trying to look casual. "You've always said control matters." I told him control mattered when Margaret and I were building the company. Maybe it mattered less now. His eyes sharpened. "You still have 62%. That's more control than you need." He said it naturally. Too naturally. Rachel and I had never told Vanessa that number. Martin had never discussed it outside official meetings. I folded my napkin and asked, "How do you know the exact percentage?" Ethan's hand stopped halfway to his glass. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he gave me the answer I expected. "You showed me the estate documents." I nodded. 2 years ago. He shrugged. "I remember numbers." Ethan did not remember numbers. He remembered grievances, birthdays, property addresses, baseball statistics, and every occasion on which I had disappointed him. Percentages vanished from his mind unless they mattered. I decided not to press. Instead, I asked what a fair succession plan looked like to him. He relaxed again. He said he did not expect me to hand him the company tomorrow, but he believed he should have a meaningful voting position while I was still around to guide him. That phrase sounded like legal advice. Not Ethan. I asked how much. He said he had not thought about specifics. Then, less than a minute later, he suggested 15% of my voting interest as a starting point. People reveal more when they think you have already agreed with the premise. That night, I called Rachel and repeated the conversation word for word. She was quiet for a moment, then said, 15% is interesting. I asked why. She explained that 15% alone would not give Ethan control, but in combination with certain minority holders and depending on the issue being voted, it could give him enough influence to block or force negotiations around major decisions. More importantly, if he obtained proxy authority over part of my voting interest, rather than an outright transfer. The arrangement could be presented as temporary, and therefore less alarming to me. Tom, has anyone recently asked you to sign a package of documents for the project? Rachel asked. I remembered an envelope Vanessa had brought to my house almost 2 months earlier. Before the financing dispute, she had said Ethan needed routine confirmation that I was aware of his development. I had been leaving for a medical appointment and told her to leave the papers. I never signed them. At the time, I had assumed they were investor questionnaires. I suddenly wanted that envelope back. I found it in a stack of unopened correspondence on the credenza in my study, exactly where I had left it. Margaret used to say my filing system depended on gravity and memory. She was right. Inside were 8 documents. Most were harmless: a family relationship disclosure, a statement that no Hale lodging entity was currently a borrower on the development, and a general consent to receive project updates. Buried between them was a limited proxy form. The language was dense, but not complicated enough to fool someone who had spent 40 years signing hotel contracts. It would have authorized Ethan, for a stated period, to exercise voting authority over a portion of my Hale lodging interest for purposes related to strategic coordination, financing alignment, and affiliated asset planning. That wording was broad enough to make Rachel swear when I sent her a photograph. My signature line was blank. At the bottom, however, there was a handwritten note in Vanessa's writing: Tom, just sign all marked tabs. E. Needs these by Friday. She had placed a yellow tab beside the proxy. The discovery changed the shape of the problem again. Vanessa had not simply been encouraging Ethan to use my reputation. She had placed a document in my house that could have shifted actual voting authority if I had signed it without reading. It would not have transferred my stock. It would not have made Ethan chairman. It would not have given him the 62% controlling interest outright. But it would have created exactly the kind of foothold Rachel had warned me about. I felt foolish because the plan depended on one of my worst habits: trusting family paperwork more than business paperwork. I had signed school forms for Ethan without reading them, loan documents for his first condo after only a quick glance, and birthday checks large enough to change a young man's year. Vanessa had learned that family requests often passed through a different door in my mind. That door had stayed unlocked because I believed loving someone meant making things easy for them. Rachel arranged a meeting with me in her office the next morning, along with Martin. We spread the proxy, the ownership chart, the fake letter of intent, and Daniel's hotel records across a long conference table. Martin looked sick. If this had been signed, he said, we'd have had to determine the exact scope before every contested vote. Rachel agreed. She also cautioned us not to overstate what the document meant. It did not magically transfer control, depending on interpretation. Parts might even have been challenged, but its presence mattered because it showed intent to obtain authority rather than merely financial assistance. Martin asked the question I had been avoiding. Do we know Ethan knew this was in the package? Rachel looked at me. I told them about the 15% figure. Martin leaned back and exhaled. That's not coincidence. Rachel was more careful. It's evidence of knowledge about the desired outcome, not yet proof he approved every step Vanessa took. That distinction became important sooner than I expected. I invited Ethan to my house 2 days later and did something that surprised him. I did not confront him with the proxy. I put the ownership chart on the table instead. Did you give this to Vanessa? I asked. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. He could have lied. I watched him consider it. Then his shoulders dropped. Yes. The word felt heavier than I expected. I asked when. Last year. Why? He rubbed his face with both hands. Because she kept asking what happens when you're gone. I asked whether she was worried about me or about what she would receive. Ethan snapped. That's not fair. I told him fairness was no longer our immediate problem. Accuracy was. He admitted he had shown Vanessa the structure because she believed I might leave Hale Lodging to outside management, charity, or some trust that would permanently limit his control. She thought you were setting things up so I'd inherit money but never have a say. I asked whether he thought that too. He looked directly at me and said, sometimes, yes. Then came the part I had hoped not to hear. Ethan admitted he knew Vanessa had spoken with advisors about succession scenarios. He knew she had asked questions about my capacity. though he claimed she framed them as precautionary. He knew she had used information from the ownership chart when speaking to consultants. He also knew my scanned signature had appeared on the draft investor letter before the anniversary party. I told her it was too aggressive, he said. I asked if he told her to remove it. He did not answer. Did you know the letter went out? I asked. Ethan looked toward the window. I knew some version went out. That was enough. I felt something inside me settle rather than break. For days, I had been trying to preserve a version of reality in which Vanessa was manipulating my son without his knowledge. That version was gone. Ethan had not been dragged into the situation. He had walked into it because part of him believed he deserved what they were trying to obtain. He became angry when he saw disappointment on my face. Don't look at me like I'm some criminal, he said. You built all of this, while Mom practically raised me alone. You missed games, birthdays, college visits, everything. Then when I got older, you handed me money and called it support. You controlled the company, the family money, the trust. Every major decision. You get to decide when everyone is worthy. I let him finish. He deserved that much. Then I said, you're right about some of it. That stopped him. I told him I had been a poor father in ways money could not repair. I had chosen negotiations over baseball games because hotels were easier than feelings. I had let Margaret do emotional work I did not know how to do. After she died, I had tried to compensate by giving more. But none of that gives you the right to put my signature on documents I didn't approve. Ethan's eyes dropped. I didn't put it there. I said, you let it stay. For the first time, Ethan told me what Vanessa had really been saying behind closed doors. She believed I would eventually freeze him out. She had become convinced after Margaret's death that I intended to professionalize the company permanently and leave Ethan only passive wealth. To Vanessa, passive wealth was almost an insult because it meant money without status, income without control, comfort without authority. Ethan admitted she had repeatedly asked why I should continue making decisions until the day I dropped dead. He hated the way she said it. He claimed, but he also feared she might be right about my intentions. I thought if I got some voting authority while you were still here, you'd finally have to treat me like part of the company. I asked if the South End project was supposed to be the justification. He nodded slowly. If Hale Lodging supported the deal, Ethan could argue that stronger coordination between his company and mine required formal family authority. It was a business rationale built around a personal grievance. I asked about the proxy. Ethan's face changed. That was the first genuine surprise I saw from him. What proxy? I slid a copy across the table. He read the first page, then the second. His forehead tightened. By the time he reached the signature section, he looked pale. I never saw this version. I told him Vanessa had brought it to my house with a note telling me to sign every marked tab. Ethan stood and began pacing. She told me she was preparing a preliminary transition packet. I asked what he thought that meant. Something for later. Something we'd discuss with you. I believed he was telling the truth about not seeing that specific draft. But that did not make him innocent. He had helped create the environment in which Vanessa felt entitled to act. He had supplied the ownership chart, tolerated the scanned signature, and allowed investors to believe I backed his project. Still, the proxy taught me something important. Ethan and Vanessa were not perfectly aligned. Their goals overlapped, but Vanessa had moved farther than Ethan realized. That crack between them became the first real advantage I had. I did not tell Ethan what I planned to do. I simply said I was willing to consider a legitimate family succession discussion if he provided every document, every proposed term, and every financing request in writing. No more hallway conversations. No more drafts with signatures. No more assumptions. I said. Ethan looked exhausted. You're actually considering it, I told him. I was considering hearing the full proposal. That was true. Hearing it was not the same as accepting it. I also told him Vanessa should be involved because if she had concerns about succession, I wanted them stated openly. Ethan nodded, though I could tell he was unsure whether he had just won or lost something. After he left, I called Rachel. I want them to believe I'm ready to transition control, I said. She asked how far I was willing to let the performance go. Far enough that they stop hiding what they want. The next week gave me proof that the damage had already escaped the family. Martin called to say one of Hale Lodging's smaller revolving credit facilities had been placed under temporary review. It was not our primary line, and operations were unaffected. But the lender had received what they called market questions regarding succession instability and potential changes in control. Nobody could tell us exactly who had raised those questions. That did not matter. The rumor had reached people who made decisions with real money. 2 days later, one of our independent directors called me directly. He was polite but uncomfortable. "Tom, I hate asking this, but is there any truth to concerns about your health or decision-making?" I sat at my desk, staring at the framed photograph of Margaret beside the phone. I told him I was healthy, competent, and very much in control. He apologized. The apology did not help. For the first time, Ethan and Vanessa's private resentment had placed a shadow over the company Margaret had helped build. That afternoon, Rachel forwarded me an email Vanessa had sent to Ethan, copying 2 advisors and a potential investor. The subject line read "Family Transition Meeting." The message proposed a formal presentation covering project financing, temporary voting coordination, and long-term leadership continuity. At the bottom, Vanessa had chosen the location herself, the Ashford Grand. Same hotel, same ballroom wing, same building where she had poured wine over my head while her friend recorded it. She wrote that the setting would provide neutral ground and symbolic continuity. I almost admired the nerve of it. Rachel called a minute later. "She thinks you're moving toward agreement." I looked at the email again. "Good," I said. "Let her." Then I noticed one sentence buried in the scheduling notes: "We should finalize authority before external confidence deteriorates further." That was the moment the balance shifted. Vanessa was no longer trying to hide the pressure. She intended to use the instability they had helped create as an argument for giving Ethan more control. And for the first time since the anniversary party, I knew exactly where I wanted them to take that argument. For the next several days, I gave Ethan and Vanessa exactly what they thought they wanted: cooperation. I stopped challenging their language. I stopped correcting every assumption. When Ethan called to ask whether I was comfortable moving forward, I told him I wanted to see a complete proposal before deciding anything. Vanessa immediately became warmer. She sent me a message saying, "I'm glad we're finally thinking like a family again." I read it twice because the sentence told me more than she realized. To her, family harmony had apparently returned the moment I became useful. Rachel warned me not to become smug about that observation. People make mistakes when they think they're winning. She said, "So do people who think they've figured everyone out." She was right. My job was not to outsmart Vanessa in some theatrical way. My job was to make sure whatever happened next rested on documents, witnesses, and choices she and Ethan made themselves. If they wanted authority, I intended to make them describe precisely how much, for what purpose, and at whose risk. I sent Ethan a short written request through Rachel. Before any family transition discussion, I wanted a consolidated proposal covering 5 things the exact voting authority requested. The duration of that authority. Every Hale Lodging asset they wanted connected to the South End project. The amount of capital support they expected, and the business justification for each request. I also required a complete list of investors who had been told or allowed to believe Hale Lodging supported the development. Ethan called within 20 minutes. "Why are lawyers involved if this is supposed to be family?" he asked. I told him because the moment voting rights and collateral entered a conversation, it stopped being a kitchen table discussion. He sighed but agreed. Vanessa was less cautious. She emailed Rachel directly and wrote that over-formalizing the process could damage trust. Rachel forwarded it to me with one sentence: "People usually dislike formalities when ambiguity benefits them." I didn't respond to Vanessa. 2 days later, a 43-page transition package arrived in Rachel's inbox. The proposal surprised even me. It asked that I grant Ethan proxy authority over 15% of my voting interest for an initial period of 30 months, renewable by mutual agreement. It described the arrangement as necessary for leadership continuity and market confidence. It also proposed that one Hale Lodging property outside Charlotte serve as secondary collateral, supporting a portion of Ethan's development financing. The hotel they selected was profitable, recently renovated, and carried relatively little debt, which made it particularly attractive to lenders. They were not asking me merely to lend $750,000 anymore. They were asking me to place a stable company asset behind a riskier private development and to give Ethan meaningful influence inside the company while the debt was outstanding. Martin ran the numbers and shook his head. The downside belongs mostly to us. The upside belongs mostly to Ethan. Rachel pointed to the voting section. And if the project gets stressed, they can argue greater coordination requires more authority. The proposal was not a coup. It was more sophisticated than that. It was a doorway. Vanessa called me that evening and asked whether I had read it. I told her I was still reviewing. She laughed lightly. Don't let Rachel scare you with legal language. This is really about giving Ethan a seat at the table. I asked why a seat required a hotel as collateral. She said lenders needed reassurance. I asked why Ethan's development could not stand on its own financing. Her tone changed. Because markets reward scale. Tom, you know that better than anyone. I said nothing. She continued. You built something valuable. Isn't the point for your family to benefit from it? That was the philosophy underneath everything. Not stewardship. Access. I asked whether she had drafted the proxy language herself. There was a pause long enough to answer the question. Then she said advisors had helped. Ethan understands the intent. I did not ask whether he understood every term. That question would have warned her. Instead, I said, I'll see both of you at the meeting. Her voice softened again. Good. I really think this could heal things. I wondered whether she believed that, or simply needed to believe that ambition and reconciliation were the same thing. 3 nights before the meeting, Ethan came to my house alone. He looked tired, not polished, no jacket, no carefully rehearsed language. He stood in my kitchen and asked if I had a minute. I poured coffee for both of us. He did not touch his. Did you know the proposal uses the Concord property as collateral? He asked. I told him I did. He looked embarrassed. Vanessa told me it would be more general. A portfolio support concept. I asked whether he had read the package before it was sent. He admitted he had skimmed it. That answer brought back every mistake I had made with him. I had taught him that details were something other people handled. Lawyers. Accountants. His father. Now he was discovering what happened when someone else wrote the details of his ambition. She says it's normal. He told me. I said it might be normal for a lender to want collateral. That did not mean Hale Lodging should provide it. Ethan stared into his cup. I wanted influence. Dad, I'm not sure I wanted this. I asked him what he did want. For once, he didn't have a fast answer. Finally, he said, I wanted you to stop seeing me as the kid who needs rescuing. The irony sat between us so heavily neither of us could ignore it. I said, then stop building deals that require rescue. He flinched, and I immediately regretted the sharpness. But he nodded. There. Then he told me he and Vanessa had been arguing. He had questioned the section about my decision-making continuity. And Vanessa became furious. She said they had already come too far to hesitate. Ethan also discovered that she had been communicating directly with one of the financial advisors about scenarios in which my voting authority might be challenged if I became erratic. He asked whether that could actually happen. I told him courts did not strip competent adults of control because a daughter-in-law thought they were stubborn. Rachel had explained that clearly, but repeated rumors could still hurt confidence. Relationships. And negotiations. Ethan whispered. I didn't think it would get this far. I believed him. That did not erase his role. The next morning, Vanessa realized Rachel had been collecting documentation. I don't know who told her. Possibly one of the advisors. Possibly Ethan said more during their argument than he intended. Whatever the source, her strategy changed immediately. She canceled 2 informal investor calls and sent a carefully worded email to several parties, stating that I had recently reconsidered prior family understandings and that project timing might shift because of unpredictable leadership decisions. It was clever because almost every phrase was subjective enough to defend. She did not call me incompetent. She suggested inconsistency. She did not accuse me of dishonesty. She implied changing commitments. Within hours, Charles Grayson called Ethan asking whether Hale family support had been withdrawn. Ethan called me afterward. angry and frightened. "She's making it look like you backed out," he said. I asked him who had originally allowed Grayson to think I had backed in. Ethan went silent. Then he said, "I know." That was the first time I heard him accept responsibility without attaching one of my failures to the end of the sentence. Rachel advised canceling the succession meeting. "We have enough to protect the company," she said. Martin agreed. We could send formal notices to lenders, clarify representation, authority, preserve the documents, and stop there. It was the safest option. I almost accepted it. Then I thought about the investors who had already been told contradictory stories, the board members hearing rumors, the bank reviewing our credit line, and Ethan, still living halfway between admitting what happened and believing Vanessa could somehow explain it away. Quiet legal protection would defend Hale Lodging, but it would not resolve the false narrative. Worse, it would leave every participant with a different version of the truth. I told Rachel I wanted the meeting to proceed, but not as Vanessa had designed it. We would invite only people directly connected to the disputed representations, Rachel. Martin, 2 independent Hale Lodging directors, Daniel Mercer, Charles Grayson, and another investor who had received the letter. No audience. I said. No humiliation. Rachel looked at me carefully. And no ambush, I answered. No new evidence. Just the documents everyone already touched. We notified Ethan and Vanessa that because the proposal involved company assets and voting rights, corporate representatives would attend. Vanessa called immediately. This was supposed to be private. I told her private ended when outside investors received my name and company information. She said bringing directors would make Ethan look unprepared. Then he should prepare, I replied. She accused Rachel of turning me against the family. I almost reminded her that Rachel had not poured wine on me or copied my signature. But I let the thought pass. Vanessa finally said, "Fine. If you want to make this a boardroom performance, we'll do it your way." That sentence reassured me. She still thought the meeting was about persuasion. She believed the purpose was to convince me that transferring authority would solve the instability surrounding Hale Lodging. She did not yet understand that the instability itself had become evidence. After the call, Rachel asked if I was ready for Vanessa to attack my competence directly. I told her I didn't know. "Then know what you won't do," she said. "Don't argue about your dignity. Facts don't need volume." The evening before the meeting, I picked up the suit Vanessa had stained with wine. The cleaner had done an impressive job. The jacket looked nearly new, except for a faint burgundy shadow at the inside edge of one cuff. I could have worn something better. I owned better. Instead, I chose that suit, not as a stunt. Nobody else would probably notice the mark. I wanted to notice it. The wine had embarrassed me for 10 minutes. The documents could have changed ownership rights, damaged credit relationships, and put company assets behind a private gamble. I needed to remember the distinction. Revenge would focus on the glass. Responsibility had to focus on the paper. I laid the suit on my bed and took Margaret's photograph from the dresser. In it, she was 58, standing outside our first renovated hotel with paint on one hand and a smile that made success look accidental. "I made this mess too," I said to the photograph. I meant Ethan, not the company. Money had been my apology for absence. Now all of us were paying interest on it. The meeting was scheduled for 10 the next morning in a private conference room on the second floor of the Ashford Grand. I arrived at 8:30. Daniel met me near the elevators and asked whether I wanted extra security stationed outside. I told him no. He had preserved the ballroom camera footage, the original event package, and the sales records showing when Ethan's materials had been submitted. Rachel arrived next with 2 organized binders and a laptop. Martin brought a summary explaining exactly what the proposed collateral arrangement would expose Hale Lodging to. The 2 directors came separately, both uneasy but professional. Charles Grayson arrived last among the outsiders and looked surprised to see me already seated at the head of the table. I deliberately moved to a side chair. "This isn't a chairman's meeting," I told him. "It's a facts meeting." On the table were only documents that had already appeared earlier in the story. The scanned letter, Vanessa's succession email, the ownership chart, the unsigned proxy, the new proposal, and copies of relevant correspondence. Ethan arrived alone at 952. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the room. I watched him scan the directors. Rachel, Martin, Daniel, and the investors. Where's Vanessa? I asked. He said she was parking. Then, quietly, he added, she thinks you're trying to destroy us. I told him I was trying to determine what had been represented in my name and whether company property had been offered without authority. What happens after that depends on what's true. Ethan sat across from me, for the first time in years. He looked less like a developer asking for money and more like the boy who once waited by the front window for me to come home from a business trip. I hated that my memory could still soften me at the worst possible time. He leaned forward and whispered, Dad, if she crossed lines I didn't know about, you need to understand I wasn't trying to take your company. I answered just as quietly. Then when the truth comes out, don't protect the lie just because you helped start it. Odzechetre. The conference room door opened, and Vanessa walked in carrying a leather portfolio. She wore a cream-colored suit, her hair perfectly arranged, her expression composed enough to convince anyone who had not seen the anniversary video. She smiled at Charles, nodded to the directors, then looked at me. The smile disappeared when she noticed the suit I was wearing. Maybe she recognized it. Maybe she noticed the faint stain at the cuff. Her eyes moved from me to Rachel's binders, then to the laptop positioned where everyone could see it. The opening frame on the screen showed the hotel corridor on the night of the party. Vanessa, standing with her wine glass several feet away from the phone recording me. Beside the laptop lay the proxy she had marked for my signature and the 43-page proposal she had sent herself. Vanessa stopped beside her chair. What exactly is this? She asked. I folded my hands on the table and said, the succession meeting you requested. Daniel quietly closed the door behind her, and for the first time since she poured that wine, Vanessa no longer looked certain she controlled what happened next. Vanessa remained standing for a moment after Daniel closed the door. One hand still wrapped around the leather portfolio she had carried in, as if it were a shield. Then she sat beside Ethan and looked around the room with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years believing composure could substitute for control. I thought this meeting was about Thomas's transition plan, she said. Rachel opened one of the binders but did not speak. I answered instead. It is about transition. Vanessa. Specifically, the transition from assumptions to facts. Charles Grayson shifted in his chair. One of the independent directors glanced down at the documents in front of him. I placed the letter bearing my scanned signature at the center of the table. Before anybody discusses voting authority, collateral, or succession, I want one simple question answered. Who authorized this? Vanessa looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the document. Nobody looked at me. That told me the room already understood more than anyone wanted to admit. Ethan spoke first. I knew a draft existed. His voice was low. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. He kept going. I knew the signature had been pulled from an older file, but I believed it was presentation material, not something being represented as final. Charles leaned forward. I received that exact version. Ethan looked at him. Charles continued. Your team sent it with the financing package. I understood it to mean Thomas intended to provide strategic and financial support if the project required it. Vanessa interrupted. That interpretation was never guaranteed. Rachel finally spoke. The issue is not whether the letter created a legally enforceable guarantee. The issue is whether people were encouraged to rely on a representation Thomas never approved. Vanessa folded her arms. Nobody transferred money because of that letter alone. Charles answered before Rachel could. Maybe not alone, but it influenced how seriously we took the deal. I watched Ethan's face change. Until then, I think part of him still believed the false letter had been harmless because no one had yet demanded payment from me. I slid the ownership chart across the table next. 7 months before the anniversary party, Vanessa sent this to an advisor while asking what options existed if an aging controlling shareholder showed impaired financial judgment. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. That was responsible planning. I nodded. It could have been. I meant it. Except this chart wasn't public. And I wasn't impaired. Ethan stared at the table. I gave it to her, he said. Vanessa looked at him again, this time with open irritation. He continued. I thought we were discussing what happened eventually, not building a case against him now. Vanessa's voice sharpened. Nobody was building a case. Rachel turned a page in her binder. Then perhaps you can explain why your later communications repeatedly referred to decision-making instability, erratic leadership, and the need to secure authority before outside confidence deteriorates. Vanessa looked at Rachel with undisguised contempt. Lawyers can make normal family planning sound sinister if that's what they're paid to do. Rachel did not react. That was why I trusted her. Then I placed the unsigned limited proxy in front of Vanessa. For the first time all morning, she lost color. You brought this to my house, I said. You marked the signature tab. You wrote that Ethan needed it by Friday. Ethan picked up the copy and read it again even though he had already seen it at my house. I told you I never approved this wording, he said to her. Vanessa snapped. You approved the concept. Ethan shook his head. A transition discussion, not slipping a proxy into a stack of routine documents. Her jaw tightened. Don't pretend you didn't want voting power. Ethan looked at her, then at me. I did want it. The admission landed hard, but not unexpectedly. I thought Dad would never give me a real role unless we forced the issue. I knew about the signature. I knew investors believed the family was backing me. I let that happen. He swallowed, but I did not know she put that proxy in the packet. Vanessa laughed once without humor. So now you're innocent because you didn't read your own plan. I could have let them destroy each other from there. A younger version of me might have done exactly that. Instead, I stopped them. This is not a marriage counseling session. They both looked at me. Ethan has admitted what he knew. Vanessa, I'm asking what you knew. She looked toward the laptop, then back at me. I knew you were blocking him because you don't respect him, I said. That's an opinion. I asked about actions. Rachel tapped the touchpad. The hotel security footage began playing silently. Vanessa approached the corridor. Her friend stood several feet away with the phone raised. Vanessa glanced toward the phone once. Then again, the moment before she lifted the glass. She looked directly at the camera. Rachel paused the frame. Nobody spoke. I asked. Did you know she was recording Vanessa's lips pressed together? Yes. Ethan turned toward her. I asked the next question carefully. Did you pour the wine because you wanted me to react on camera? Vanessa looked at me for a long time. Then said, I wanted people to see who you really were. There it was. Not a confession to some elaborate legal scheme. Not proof that every detail had been orchestrated. Something more believable and, in a way, Uller. Vanessa wanted an image. She wanted anger. She wanted an old man shouting in a ballroom so later conversations about instability would feel plausible. I thought you'd explode. She said, you always have to control everything. I thought if people finally saw that, maybe Ethan wouldn't look like the unreasonable one. Ethan stared at her as if she had become someone else while sitting beside him. You told me you lost your temper, he said. Vanessa looked back. I did lose my temper. After checking the camera twice, he asked. Her silence was enough. I remembered the wine running down Margaret's suit and Ethan watching the phone instead of me. I asked him, did you know she wanted the reaction recorded? Ethan's face twisted with shame. I knew her friend was filming the argument. I didn't know Vanessa planned to throw the wine. I believed him, though belief no longer meant absolution. Martin then opened the 43-page proposal. He did not use emotional language. He explained numbers. Hale Lodging would assume risk against a stable hotel asset, while Ethan's private development received the direct benefit. The requested proxy would give Ethan influence over a portion of my voting interest for 30 months. If the project became distressed, lender demands could collide with company interests. One director asked Ethan whether he understood that structure when he approved the package. Ethan answered, not fully. Martin responded, that is part of the problem. You're asking for authority over assets you did not fully analyze. Vanessa said the arrangement was standard leverage. Martin replied, standard leverage is still leverage. The question is why this company should assume it. Charles Grayson added that his lending group would never have considered the project on the same terms without the apparent Hale backing. For the first time, Vanessa seemed to understand that the people she had hoped to impress were now calculating how much of her credibility depended on someone else's balance sheet. I let the room settle before telling them what would happen next. No one is being arrested today. No one is being dragged out by security. I'm not interested in spectacle. Vanessa looked almost relieved. Then I continued. Hale Lodging would issue written notice to every lender, investor, advisor, and counterparty we could identify, stating that Ethan had no authority to bind the company, pledge its assets, or speak on my behalf. The South End development would receive no company collateral and no personal bridge loan from me. Any documents implying otherwise would be formally withdrawn. I turned to Ethan. You will keep the 8% non-voting economic interest I already gave you. I'm not taking back gifts because I'm angry. His eyes lifted. But there will be no additional transfer of voting interest under the current plan. No proxy. No 15%. No shortcut. Vanessa's expression hardened. I had finally touched the thing she valued most, not luxury itself, but access to the mechanism that produced it. Ethan asked quietly. So that's it, I'm cut out. I shook my head. No, you're cut off from automatic rescue. I told him if he ever wanted to work with Hale Lodging, invest alongside us, or propose a legitimate development partnership, he could do so under the same review process any outside developer faced. Independent underwriting, conflict disclosures, no family assumptions, no private promises. If your project is good, it should survive being treated like a project instead of an inheritance. Ethan looked down. Vanessa pushed her chair back slightly. You're humiliating him in front of everyone. I turned to her. No, I'm refusing to hide the consequences from the people who were asked to rely on his representations. I also told the directors that any future succession plan for Hale Lodging would go through formal governance channels. Not family pressure. Professional management would continue. Ownership and leadership would no longer be treated as the same thing simply because my son shared my last name. Charles Grayson closed his folder and said his group would need to reassess the South End financing from the beginning. Vanessa turned toward him immediately. Charles, the underlying project hasn't changed. He answered. The perceived support behind it has. That distinction cost them more than any speech I could have made. Within 2 weeks, Charles's group withdrew from the proposed structure. Another investor demanded revised terms. Ethan eventually had to sell a portion of his development interest to a larger regional partner to meet obligations already underway. He did not lose everything. I made sure of nothing. I did not call lenders against him, interfere with permits, or use Hale Lodging to punish him. The market simply recalculated the deal, without my reputation sitting invisibly underneath it. Ethan remained involved, but he no longer controlled the project. For a man who had spent years believing control would prove he was finally his own man. The irony was painful enough without my adding to it. Before the meeting ended, Daniel asked if I wanted the hotel to issue a trespass notice against Vanessa because of the wine incident. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw fear without anger covering it. I shook my head. No. Daniel seemed surprised. Mr. Chairman, what happened was unacceptable. I agreed. But this hotel is not my personal weapon. I looked at Vanessa. If you come here as a guest and behave like a guest, you'll be treated like one. She stared at me, perhaps waiting for a sharper punishment. I had none to offer. Public humiliation had been her language. Not mine. I had already shown the people who mattered what happened. Posting the video online, banning her from properties, or trying to ruin her socially would have transformed accountability into revenge. I had spent too much of my life confusing power with responsibility to make that mistake now. Ethan and Vanessa left separately. That told me more than any argument could have. Over the next month, their marriage deteriorated badly. Ethan moved into a furnished apartment near one of his construction sites for what he called space. Vanessa accused him of sacrificing her to regain my approval. Ethan accused her of turning every private frustration he had ever shared into leverage. I stayed out of it. That was new for me. In the past, I would have paid for counseling, offered a vacation, refinanced something, or found some practical solution, because practical solutions let me avoid emotional helplessness. This time I did nothing unless Ethan asked for conversation rather than money. He called twice. The first time we talked about the development. The second time, several weeks later, he asked if he could come over. He arrived after dark and sat in the same kitchen chair where he had once asked me for $750,000. I wanted to see you lose, he said. No preamble. No excuse. I looked at him and waited. At the party, he continued, when Vanessa started pushing you, part of me wanted you to blow up. I wanted everyone to see you as the guy I remembered when I was younger, the man who could make a room feel like work. His eyes reddened, but he did not cry. I knew she was going too far. I knew the letter was wrong. I didn't stop it because I thought, maybe if you looked weak for once, I'd finally stop feeling weak around you. That hurt more than the forged signature. Paper could be corrected. A son wanting his father diminished was harder to repair. I told him I was sorry for the father I had been when he was young. I told him he had deserved more games, more dinners, more ordinary evenings when I was physically present and mentally somewhere else. But I won't apologize for refusing to let guilt become your ownership contract, I said. Ethan nodded slowly. I know. I told him money had become the most dishonest language in our relationship because both of us used it to say things we were afraid to say directly. I used checks to say I was sorry. He used requests to ask whether he mattered. Eventually, every refusal felt like rejection, and every gift felt like proof that I still controlled the terms. That stops now, I said. He asked whether I still planned to leave him anything someday. I almost smiled at the question because it was so human, so imperfectly timed. And so, Ethan, yes, I said, but not because you pressure me, and not because you're entitled to run what you didn't build. I told him my estate plan would provide for him and any future grandchildren, but Hale Lodging's governance would be structured so no single heir could casually mortgage company assets or turn a family grievance into corporate policy. Ethan absorbed that without arguing. It was the first adult conversation we had ever had that did not end with me solving something for him. Over the following months, I worked with Rachel, Martin, and the board on a formal succession framework. Professional executives would continue running daily operations. Voting rights would be governed through a trust structure with independent safeguards. Ethan's economic interest remained intact, but leadership would have to be earned through competence, not bloodline. I reduced my own day-to-day involvement gradually, not because Vanessa had been right about my age, but because some of what she feared was inevitable one day. I would be gone. The mistake was believing preparation required surrendering judgment while I was still capable of using it. The smaller credit facility returned to normal status after we clarified governance and representation authority. Rumors faded. The anniversary video disappeared into the endless graveyard of forgotten internet clips. I never asked for it to be removed. I never watched it again. The faint burgundy stain remained inside the cuff of Margaret's suit. However, and I chose not to have the cleaner try a second time. A few months after the meeting, I stopped at the Ashford Grand on a quiet Tuesday morning. No board session, no investor presentation, no family crisis. I simply wanted coffee before meeting Rachel across town. Daniel spotted me in the lobby and walked over. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Should I have the executive room opened? I shook my head. I'm just here for coffee. He smiled and left me alone. At the lobby cafe, a young employee I had never met held a paper cup and asked for my name. She had no idea who I was, which pleased me more than it should have. For most of my life, I thought legacy meant building something large enough that people remembered your name. Then I spent years terrified that failing Ethan meant I had built the wrong legacy entirely. I finally understood that neither fear was quite right. A name can open doors, secure loans, impress strangers, and tempt family. It cannot tell you who deserves your trust. Name, the young woman asked again. Marker poised above the cup. I looked across the lobby at the hotel Margaret and I once could only have dreamed of owning. I thought about Ethan trying to rebuild a project without my guarantee. Vanessa learning that status borrowed from another person can disappear overnight. And myself learning that love without boundaries eventually becomes another form of dishonesty. I did not know whether my son and I would ever become close in the way we both wished we had been. Some years cannot be repurchased, Some apologies do not restore what was missed. But I no longer intended to pay people to remain near me, rescue them so they would forgive me, or surrender control just to prove I loved them. I smiled at the barista and said, "Tom." She wrote it on the cup without looking up. That was enough. I did not need her to call me chairman. And for the first time in a very long while, I did not need to buy my way into being called dad.